Okay, it's 1 o'clock and we are going to get started. Welcome everyone to Innovative MS4 Forestry Financing and Crediting Strategies webinar. Okay, so we're going to just talk through a couple housekeeping items before we get started. Please use your computer audio. Everyone is muted and cameras are disabled. But if you're having trouble with your audio, please make sure your speakers are turned up and not muted. Please also type any AV questions you might have or issues into the chat box. If the chat box is not available or you don't see it, please send us an email to forestryfinancingwebinar@tetratech.com. We are recording the webinar and it'll be sent to the link to the recording will be sent to all registrants in about 2 weeks. If you are experiencing any issues, we recommend that you exit the meeting and come back in. That typically resolves most issues. Okay, so I am Adriana Burke from Tetra Tech. Also speaking today is Mark Sievers of Tetra Tech. Liz Hyatt of Tetra Tech is on the line to help with any technical support issues. Jeff White of MDE will be facilitating the Q&A portion of the webinar, and Paul Emmert of MDE is also on the line to help answer questions. Due to time constraints, we will only be able to do 2 questions at each Q&A break and additional questions at the end. But throughout the presentation, please type in your questions into the chat box or send us an email at forestryfinancingwebinar@tetratech.com. And for any questions we don't get to, MDE will follow up afterwards. And just a quick note that the purpose of the webinar is not to demonstrate how to operate the FFIT tool, but to demonstrate the benefits of including forest planting in restoration efforts. All right, and so to kick off things, we're going to do our first poll question. So have you ever used the FFIT tool? So you should see it pop up in your on your screen. So if you have, please answer yes, no, you've heard of it, but you'd like to have more information, or not yet, but I plan to. So let's view the results. And it looks like right now, a large majority have heard of it, but would like to have more information, and many are saying no, they haven't heard of it. So great. You're in the right place to learn more information about the FFIT tool. All right. And then we will move on. Okay, so just some quick context about this webinar and why forestry is an important BMP. Maryland has a robust NPDES and MS4 permit structure, and permits are the restoration drivers. Jurisdictions can choose which best management practices to install. Okay, so we're going to just walk through just a couple things about the Maryland Forestry Financing Implementation Tool, or FFIT tool. Okay, so the FFIT tool is a calculator for those seeking loans to fund forestry efforts and earn restoration credits. Here on the slide that you'll have access to later is the link, and this will take you to MDE's tool implementation toolkit website. Then you'd click on the FFIT tool link at the top, and then you'll be able to get access to the tool, the user's guide, a link to an instruction video, and other resources. Also note, throughout this presentation, you'll see many slides that have blue underlined text, and these are links which will take you to additional information. So the FFIT tool is a tool developed to promote forestry planting and to show its advantages. It's a calculator that can assist local governments seeking below market interest rate loans to fund forestry efforts and earn restoration credits. It'll also help you explore potential interest payments based on different interest rates, and it ties together a number of programs, including the MS4 permit program, TMDL restoration, habitat and natural resources, and source water protection. It also allows permittees to look for cost-effective measures and quantify co-benefits. So in a nutshell, the FFIT tool will have users input user-defined items such as acres, trees, costs. The outputs would be an estimated total of project cost and loan repayment information, and you will get load reductions, estimated cost efficiencies, and estimated carbon reductions. And on the slide here are some example questions that can be answered by the FFIT tool. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mark Sievers of Tetra Tech to discuss funding mechanisms to support restoration.
Okay, thank you, Adriana. First off, there are multiple types of funding available. There's federal, state, and local sources of funding that includes grants and loans. Please be aware that each type of funding has limitations, so make sure you review the terms of the funding, such as the need for matching funds. More than one type of funding can be used, but be aware that some funding mechanisms can be combined with other types and some cannot. So again, please be sure to review the terms of the funding. This is just a partial list of funding mechanisms that are available to you. They have some federal, state, and other types of sources of funding. We're not going to go over each type of these funding mechanisms on this call, but in the right-hand column, you'll see that everything is linked to more information on that program. So we're going to look at some sources of federal funding. The first source is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, or CWSRF. These are low interest loans. The initial funds do come from federal sources, but once the loan is repaid to the state can then use the funds to provide additional SRF project loans. Also, if everyone can turn off their mics because I can hear some background noise. A small portion of the SRF loans do get redirected to non-point source projects. Riparian forest buffers and forest planties are part of the CWSRF program, and you can get funding for those. There is also the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which you might be able to get funding through. Recently, there is the bipartisan infrastructure bill. This allocated $140 million to Maryland, with $43 million of that going directly towards the CWSRF program. As with the SRF program, it does include stormwater, and trees is available for these loans. The infrastructure bill does have a 49% of the funds that will be available for grants or principal forgiveness loans. The CWSRF loans can offer better terms than conventional loans. For example, it could have an interest rate of 1% versus 5% for other types of loans. CWSRF does have periods of 3, 5, 10, 20, 30, and 40 years with potential milestones that could trigger principal and interest forgiveness. Recently, EPA put out a guidance for using SRF funds for 9-point source solutions, and there is a link to that. In that document, they do give some examples, which we'll look at on this slide. They gave the example of having a fixed budget of not to exceed $1 million. So what are your financing options? Using conventional loans at a 2% interest, using conventional loans, you would only have $820,000 available for the actual project. That is because you would have $180,000 in interest, and the $180,000 and the $820 would add up to the maximum budget you have of $1 million. Then hypothetically, if you have a CWSRF loan with a 0% interest rate, you'd be able to use the entire $1 million for your project. This would be equivalent of receiving a grant for $180,000 or an 18% cost savings. At the bottom of the slide is a table directly out of that new EPA non-point source guidance for SRF programs, where if you have a SRF rate of 0% and a market rate of 2%, and you can see you get an 18% savings from that. So how are the loans allocated? Well, MDE allocates SRF loans on a competitive basis. Your projects are scored and ranked based on a variety of factors such as nitrogen reduction, effectiveness, cost efficiency, acres restored, and mitigation of potential problems such as flooding, and compliance with TMDLs and waters. To receive the maximum load reduction points, you do need to reduce 2,000 pounds of total nitrogen. This would get you 25 points in your score versus 15 or 5% for lower nitrogen reductions. The table on the lower right of the slide shows you how much riparian buffers you would need for various land use types to get to that 2,000 pounds of nitrogen. And as you can see, since we're talking mainly about MS4s, you would need 139 acres of turf converted to riparian forest buffers to meet that 2,000 pound nitrogen reduction. And just want to note that those 139 acres do not need to be contiguous. So you can bundle planting on multiple properties to get to that 139 acres. The slide just has the general application timeline where you would submit applications in January, and then you'd be notified in October of that year that you will be receiving funding. All in all, it takes about 1.5 years from application to actually receiving the funding. Now looking at some state sources of funding, there is the Tree Solution Now Act of 2021. This has a climate mitigation goal of 5 million trees by the end of 2031. Of those 5 million trees, 500,000 are for urban underserved communities, with the remainder going to large lots and reforestation. There is $15 million available per year from 2022 to 2031, with the first year of that funding going 10 million going towards urban tree planting and equipment, and then 2.5 million going to DNR and MDA. This funding is being allocated through Chesapeake Bay Trust Urban Trees Grant Program. Please note the solicitation for this year closed on March 3rd, with awards and planting to start later this year. This 5 million trees are in addition to the 7 million trees that are pledged through the 2030 Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act plan. And now looking at local sources of funding can be paired with CWSRF and other federal and state funds as a matching source of funds. These funds could be something like utility fees, stormwater utility fees, or ad valorem taxes. It could be money coming from your CIP budgets or through general obligation bonds. You can also leverage funds by building a team and bringing stakeholders together, such as working with your Department of Finance, Department of Public Works, and Sustainability Office. You can also partner with groups that can help move forward with your plans, such as non-government organizations or NGOs. A good example of leveraging funding at a local level is the Bettlemead Walkable Watershed Project in Richmond, Virginia, where they leverage the Chesapeake Bay Trust Green Streets, Green Jobs, and Green Towns, or G3 funding, with some additional foundation funding to get 100% of their design funding for their project. They then leveraged 4 different funding sources to fund their implementation phase. And again, there is a link there to a PowerPoint presentation where you can learn more about this project and the funding sources that they used. Ways to reduce costs and help with incentives. You can reduce costs by using volunteers to help plan and maintain the forest or buffers. You can work with other county municipal agencies or NGOs to share funding responsibilities, and you can provide or use incentives towards businesses, NGOs, residents, such as credits on stormwater utility fees. The lion's share of ownership in the state is on private land, which is often inaccessible without these incentives. There is also cost savings for the forest planting and buffers that might make it more feasible. We'll go into those cost savings during the case study later on in this presentation. There's also some local economic benefits, such as having incentive payments to property owners, keeping the restoration dollars in the local community, and can also add to the local community economy through planting and maintenance. Smaller jurisdictions do have more limited resources, so there's some options out there. The slide has some options, but there's other options that are out there. In the first set of boxes to the left, to help identify sites, coordinate, and create a planting plan, small community jurisdictions can get outside technical assistance through private consultants or with the DNR foresters. And again, there is a link there to a list of the DNR foresters throughout the state. The remaining of the task can be small communities can partner with NGOs or community experts and community groups to apply and administer the grants, develop the planting and help with labor for the planting, and then also help with maintenance. And with that, we have a few minutes for questions.
Okay, Jeff, do we have any questions?
I am not seeing any right now. Do we maybe give it a minute or two if anybody wants to put anything in the chat?
Yeah, please. So folks, if you have any questions regarding funding, please put them in the chat. If you're not able to access the chat, we realize some agencies don't allow Teams chat. Please send us an email at the forestryfinancing@tetratech.com and MDE will follow up with your questions. Jeff, are there any questions that maybe you've seen that come through that or some basics that folks might be interested in?
Nope. So we have our first question coming through. So Rob Hirsch, Baltimore County, is asking, how can we learn what the WQRLF interest rate is? I don't know, Mark, if that's one you want us to field, I assume.
This is Paul. I think one of the things that people can do is if they look at the FFIT tool, there's a hyperlink within the tool which links directly to the Maryland Water Quality Finance Administration website, and that's what lists the daily interest rates. So that's actually, if you open the tool that was emailed to you, you should have gotten a copy of it. It's in cell letter C, like cat, number 50, and that's a hyperlink, and also A50 rather, A50. So the thing is that gives the loan interest rates.
Also later on in this presentation, there is a link to what the current state CWSRF rate is, and that's in a later slide, I think in case study number 1. I have a link to that.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we'll move on. But just as a reminder, any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or email us and we'll get to as many as we can.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to restoration and equivalent impervious acre crediting. I'm sure most of you on this call know that the best way to receive credit is through your MS4 annual reporting. And just remember, as with any BMP, that you need to do maintenance and verification on that BMP and report that to keep receiving the credit. On the right of the screen is the Maryland Riparian Buffer Care Catalog. This is put out through DNR. Again, there's a link at the bottom to a much larger version of this that you might actually be able to read, but this actually goes through the different months and what you should be doing to your buffer each month to maintain it. We're going to look at the credits the MDE gives. The next few slides come directly out of the Maryland 2021 wasteland allocation guidance. For non-riparian types of land use changes, they have forest planting, conservation landscaping, street trees, and urban tree canopy. For this discussion, we will be focusing on forest planting, which is basically turf to forest. So managed turf to a forested condition, where you need 100 trees per acre and you need to have at least 0.5 acres of contiguous area to take credit for this practice. The table on the right is from the guidance. and we're looking at forest planting. So there is a 11.12 pound of nitrogen reduction per acre per year from forest planting. And this is determined by the difference between the turf and forest land use loading rates of 13.43 and 2.31 pounds per acre per year, respectively. If you looked at the actual reduction percent of producing 11.12 pounds from the 13.43 pounds, you get the 83% reduction of nitrogen through forest planting. Similarly, phosphorus would have an 85% reduction and TSS would have a 79%. Off in the far right-hand column, you see the equivalent impervious acreage you get credit for per acre of land cover converted. So for forest planting, that is a 1.1 ratio that you get credit for. Next, we'll look at the riparian forest buffers and riparian conservation landscaping. Crediting for buffers works a little bit different than the forest planting. You get the same credit you get for converting turf to forest, but then you get an additional reduction on top of that. The top table on the screen goes into the reductions you get from forest planting. So you get an additional 3.22 pounds of nitrogen reduced per acre per year from the upland portion of the forest buffer. The bottom table on this slide adds up the forest planting and the additional credit you get from buffers. Then you would get a 14.34 total nitrogen reduction pound per year. And if you remember, turf loading rate is only 13.43 pounds. So that comes out to a roughly 107% reduction of total nitrogen from riparian forest buffers per acre. And again, on the far right, you will see that the equivalent impervious acre also is 1.5 impervious acre credit per acre of land cover converted for riparian forest buffers. This next slide just compiles this information that you saw on the previous two screens. Can someone put themselves on mute, please? Thank you. On the top, you will see you have the forest planting and riparian forest buffers. And there we see the 83 and 107% nitrogen reduction that we got from them. At the very bottom, we have the runoff reduction curves for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment from the runoff reduction and stormwater treatment BMPs. And you can see with a rainfall depth treated of 2 inches, you only get a 67% reduction of total nitrogen versus the 83 and 107% from forest planting and buffers. Similarly, phosphorus, you get the 78% reduction from 2 inches of traditional BMPs for runoff reductions. And the runoff reduction BMPs are things like bioretentions and swales. And then you get 4% if you treat 2 inches with that method versus the 79 and 124% you get through forest planting and riparian forest buffers. So you can see you get, a lot higher nitrogen phosphorus reductions than you get with traditional BMPs. And we're just going to summarize the impervious air crediting. For turf to forest, you get the 1.1 ratio. For turf to riparian forest buffers, you get 1.5. From agriculture to riparian forest buffers, you also get a 1.5 impervious acre credit. And that's if it's the MS4 implementing on the agricultural land. This credit is not considered water quality trading, and more information on that will be provided on the next slide. Also, just a reminder that there are 2 active waste load allocation guidances out there. There's the 2014 and the 2021 version. Phase 1 MS4s are operating under the 2021 version, which was modified to emphasize reforestation benefits, and it increased the impervious acre credit from 0.38 to 1.5 for riparian forest buffers. Phase 2 MS4s are still operating under the 2014 guidance, but it's possible for them to receive the credit using the 2021 waste load allocation guidance with MDE review and approval. And you would just need to coordinate with the MDE Stormwater Dam Safety and Flood Management Program to receive that credit. So who gets these credits? The counties and municipalities will get the credit if there's an agreement in place with the landowner. This would be a simple agreement or easement that the county can plant on private land, and then the county would get the credit. There'd be legal documents. We would recommend you have something in place before you really start planting and planting and planning. The agreement should have something that says the landowner should maintain a stated number of trees for an agreed upon time. These easements and agreements should convey with inheritance and sale of property. They should also talk about who's responsible for maintenance and inspections. And again, if you plant on agricultural land, you can get an agreement between the landowner, the county municipality, and the MS4 could get restoration land load reduction credits and impervious acre reduction credits. And with that, we'll take any questions on restoration and impervious acre crediting.
So we have one question, Mark, from Douglas Griffith with Anne Arundel County. Great question too. Doug says, is planting trees in an area dominated by low shrub / thicket eligible for forest planting credit? Which basically is asking, is planting trees on mixed open and eligible credit? And I don't know, Mark, if you want to field this one, or if you want us to field this one again, just let me know.
I think that's an MDE question.
Okay. Just wanted to give you a just wanted to give the offer first. So great question, Doug. Currently, technically, no, it is not, but it is something that we've actively been working on and having discussions on. And I don't know if it's something that Anne Arundel County is particularly interested in. I think we can follow up and have a conversation with you guys. We've been talking to some of the local jurisdictions about the appetite maybe for that type of credit, and how applicable it might be, and is tree planting on those kind of mixed open or shrubby lands, is that something that jurisdictions actively pursue? So it technically is not right now, but it is something we're working on. And then it looks like we have one more question from Ann Hairston Strang that just came in that says, in the impervious area crediting, is there an opportunity to align with the Chesapeake Bay program canopy approaches based more on canopy coverage over time? The challenges I've heard with this progressive impervious area crediting are the 2-inch DBH minimum, which could leave out some good native woody vegetation for crediting. Canopy approaches based. So Mark, again, I don't know if is that one you want us to field, or do you have any insights there?
I mean, so it sounds like she's talking about, the impervious acre crediting you get here, and trying to, is it more on, is she asking more on if the forest,
been a long time.
is it more about maintaining the forest to keep them maintained and everything, or yeah?
Hey, Mark, I think this is Paul. I think that we can follow up with Anne on this question afterwards. It's a little more complicated. It does have to do with the minimum requirements, but of course, MD-FIT allows for native grasses, and native woody vegetation would be part of that. As far as the credit goes, we'd have to check with the stormwater program, I'd say.
Yeah, and I can say just real quick, Paul, that we did in the development of those credits, we did try to align to the best as align as much as possible with Bay program protocols. But yes, there were some deviations which we thought were appropriate. But we can, like you said, Paul, we can always follow up with Ann. I don't know, Adriana or Mark, do we have time for one more, or should we keep going?
We do. We have time for one more.
Okay. So another question just came in from Ashley Bowers saying, will EIA credit eventually be applied to forest preservation and restoration practices? Mark, do you you want us to take that again, or just again?
Yeah, that's MDE policy, so I'd prefer you take that.
So for forest preservation, yes, we certainly if you go look at our MS4 accounting guidance, and I can put a link in the chat, you will see that there is EIA credits available for what we call forest conservation within that within the crediting document. So yes, that forest conservation is eligible for impervious area credits.
And I just pulled that up. It starts on page 17, and on page 18, it does show that you get a 0.46 impervious acre credit per acre of forest conserved. And then the guidelines for what is considered forest conservation credit is in the guidance as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. That looks to be it in terms of questions right now.
We're ready to move on.
Okay. Okay, we're just going to briefly go over some tree planting co-benefits. And this applies to not only buffers and forest planting, but also the urban tree canopy and street trees. On the left is just a long list of different tree planting co-benefits, from watershed health to resiliency to benefits to public and to benefits to landowners. This list was compiled through the links on the lower right. You can use these as a way to talk to your decision makers to advocate for forest planting by showing them the additional benefits of doing the forest planting and riparian forest buffers. And the green box is just some interesting information from iTree as to what one maple can do over 20 years for reducing runoff and helping with carbon. Just want to mention that FFIT does do some co-benefit estimates. The top table, it does estimate the approximate nitrogen, phosphorus, and TSS load reductions that you would get through the project that you enter into FFIT. These load reductions are using the state loading rates that are in the 2021 MDE waste load allocation guidance. It also estimates potential number of carbon credits you can get from your project and their approximate cost on a carbon market. It also looks at source water protection, such as how much you can save on drinking water treatment costs by doing your project. And with that, I'm just going to move right on into three different case studies. So we're going to look at three different case studies. The first one is mainly going to be financial, with the other two actually being technical and looking at load reductions and costing of various scenarios. And case study number one is looking at SRF and bank loan funding. On the screen, you see my MDE FFIT assumptions of planting 50 acres of land with seedlings with 100 trees per acre with a 50-50 mix of hardwood and conifers. And I just want to note that in the MDE FFIT Excel file that you received yesterday in the email, it is set up with this scenario. In this scenario, I did use contractor costs. I did use the default values that are in MDE FFIT rather than trying to figure out my own. I did use $6,000 of private payments for easements, and I added a $95,850 miscellaneous cost, which I'll go into the rationale for that in a later slide. I used a CWSRF loan rate of 0.9% versus a conventional loan of 5% over a 30-year period. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see a link that will take you to the current state revolving loan fund interest rates. And you can see it's 0.9 for regular communities and 0.4 for disadvantaged communities. And MDE FFIT does allow you to enter both of these types. The slide goes over the results of case study number one. One thing I do want to note is MDE FFIT does provide you with a low, medium, and high cost for your project. For this case study and the future case studies, I am using the medium cost when I talk about costs. So for this scenario of doing 50 acres of tree planting, it does cost an approximate $601,000. At the bottom bottom is a output from MDE FFIT, and you can see in red outline that compared to the other borrowing option, over the course of life of the loan, you would save $432,000 with SRF funding versus a conventional loan. This equates to a interest payment of $140,000 for the CDU SRF loan versus $572,000 versus a conventional loan. And also in the bottom table, you can see that your annual payments would be approximately $4,000 also. And any annual repayment savings you can get could go towards increased incentives for tree planting or help fund additional restoration projects. Before I get into the next couple case studies, I just want to go over some background on how I did some costing for traditional BMPs. The University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science did put a 2021 stormwater BMP cost analysis. This analysis used information from your MS4 reporting and FAPs to create the unit cost for BMPs. They do have unit costs by impervious acre and by total drainage area. The tree planting cost per acre is very low, and the tree planting cost per pound of nitrogen reduced is also low. At the bottom of this slide, you can see the costs that I will be using in the upcoming scenarios. I used the median cost plus 1 year of operation and maintenance. I basically used just 1 year of operation and maintenance because that is how MD FFIT calculates their costs also. You can see the UMC's report also has a forest planting cost of $12,027 per acre. And then I'm also looking at wet ponds, a mix of runoff reduction practices, and those are the practices such as bioretention and swales. And I'm also going to be looking at some stream restoration. So these are the unit costs I'm using in the next few slides. I just want to point out that, again, the UMC's report does have the forest planning unit cost of $12,027. MDE FFIT also provides the information of costing per acre in the output, so you can see how that compares. Case study 2 looks at BMP comparisons. Again, I'm using the same exact MD FFIT assumptions, and if you remember, I have that $95,000 in miscellaneous costs added to the project. That is so that the cost per acre in MDE FFIT equals that $12,027 that is in the UMC's report for forest planting. So we can compare more equally the different costs. I am using the Maryland MDE TMDO implementation progress and planning, or TIP tool, to come up with loads reductions from wet ponds, runoff reduction practices, and stream restoration. And these are just the assumptions that I used. I assumed a runoff treatment depth of 1 inch, that each BMP treats about 68% of impervious area. And again, I'm using statewide loading rates. For stream restoration, I am just using the planning rates. And for the unit costs that you saw on the previous screen, I do not include land costs for the wet ponds, runoff reduction, or stream restoration. And again, I use the median cost plus 1 year of operation maintenance to match how MDE FFIT reports the costs for tree planting. And since the UMC's report does include cost per drainage area and cost for impervious acre, I calculated the BMP costs and then just averaged them together for what I report in the case study. We're now going to start looking at the results of case study 2 in the next few slides. I just want to warn you that these are going to get technical and can be somewhat confusing. I will go over most of the material twice, but I can also stick around after the call to go over them again as needed. In the top table shows the amount of load reductions and impervious credits you would get from 50 acres of forest planting or from 50 acres of riparian forest buffers. And these load reductions do come out of the MDE FFIT, and I did verify that they are correct in the MDE TIP tool too. So they're green, which is good. And then the next few tables, we're going to be looking at the amount of stream restoration, wet ponds, and runoff reduction practices that will be needed to meet those load reductions in the top table. And because the different amounts of BMPs will be needed to meet the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reductions from the forest planting, there's going to be multiple BMP amounts in the table, so that's where things might get a little confusing. So I just want to show my first example. You'll see for riparian forest buffers in the top table, for 50 acres of riparian forest buffers in the top table, you get a total nitrogen reduction of 717 pounds. Again, for the 50 acres of riparian forest buffers, you get a total nitrogen reduction of 717 pounds. To get that same 717 pounds of nitrogen reduction that you get through riparian forest buffers, you would need you need to treat 9,560 linear feet through stream restoration. And I'll go through that again. For 50 acres of riparian forest buffer, you get 717 pounds of total nitrogen reduction. To get that same 717 pounds of total nitrogen reduction from the riparian forest buffer, you would need 9,560 linear feet treated through stream restoration. Looking at another example on this slide, you would get 89 pounds of phosphorus reduction from the 50 acres of forest planting. Again, you would get 89 pounds of phosphorus reduced through 50 acres of forest planting. To get that same 89 pounds, you would need of phosphorus reduction through forest planting, you would need to restore 1,300 linear feet through stream restoration to get the 89 pounds that we saw through forest planting. So just go through again, because I know these tables can be a little bit confusing. For riparian forest buffers, 50 acres will get you 717 pounds of nitrogen reduced, and you would need 9,560 linear feet of stream restoration to get that same amount. Similarly, to get the 89 pounds of phosphorus reduced through forest planting, you would need to restore 1,300 linear feet of stream restoration. This slide is looking at the total number of drainage area you would need from wet ponds and the runoff reduction BMP mix to get those reductions you get from riparian forest buffers and forest plantings. And the bottom table just looks at the approximate amount of impervious area you would need to treat. Again, we're looking at the 717 pounds of nitrogen from 50 acres of riparian forest buffers. You would need a runoff reduction BMP mix of 66 acres to meet that total nitrogen reduction that you got through the riparian forest buffer. And that approximately 45 acres of that 66 would need to be impervious acres treated. Again, we're looking to compare the reduction we get from 50 acres of riparian forest buffer for total nitrogen for 717. You would need approximately 66 acres treated through bioretentions and swales to get that 717 nitrogen reduction that you got through riparian forest buffers. And that would mean also about 45 acres of impervious treated. Now looking at that 89 pounds of total phosphorus reduced through forest planting of 50 acres, you would need to treat roughly 53 acres of runoff reduction to get that 89 from total phosphorus reduction from forest planting. And of those 53, approximately 36 acres would need to be through treating impervious acres through runoff reduction practices. So we're going to go on and look at costing next. Again, these are the costs to meet the load reductions based on the 50 acres of riparian forest planting and riparian forest buffers and forest plantings. So first, from the from the MD FFIT tool, we saw that riparian forest buffers will be about $601,000. To meet that same 717-pound nitrogen reduction, it would approximately be $6 million of wet ponds, runoff reduction practices, or stream restoration to get the same load reduction that you got from the 50 acres of riparian forest buffers. And that equates to about the riparian forest buffer being 10 times less than the wet ponds, runoff reduction mix, or stream restoration. Again, to meet that 717-pound nitrogen reduction that you got through 50 acres of riparian forest buffers, using forest buffers, it'd be 600,000 versus 6 million for either wet ponds, runoff reduction, or stream restoration. And then looking at the example of the 89 pounds of phosphorus reduction from forest planting, it would cost between 800,000 and 5 million to get the same reduction that you got from doing 50 acres of forest planting. And that results in a 1.3 to 8.3 times more expensive than just plain forest planting for wet ponds, the runoff reduction, and stream restoration. And now we're going to look at the cost efficiencies. Please note these are the annual cost efficiencies, not the total cost efficiencies. And MD FFIT does provide you the cost efficiency per year of your practice. So looking at the first example, we focused in on the nitrogen from riparian forest buffers. You can see the cost efficiency to get those amount, that 717-pound of nitrogen reduction, will be $28 per pound of nitrogen per year from riparian forest buffers versus $200 to $400 per pound of nitrogen per year from the other practices, meaning that the other practices are 10 to 15 or 16% higher than the cost efficiency of the riparian forest buffer. And looking at the phosphorus, 89 pounds of phosphorus reduction from forest planting, you can see that the efficiency for forest planting for phosphorus is $225 per pound of phosphorus per year versus between $450 and almost $3,000 per pound per year of phosphorus. And you can see how that compares to the forest planting at the bottom, where it's 2 to 12% higher doing the traditional methods than forest planting to receive the same amount of phosphorus reductions. You can also look at the EIA credits. You also get the cost efficiency of those. You can see the buffer and forest planting have lower cost efficiencies than the other practices to receive impervious credit. What are the overall results of this case study? You need significant reduction practices to meet the same equivalent load reduction. You get more impervious acre credits from riparian forest buffers or forest planting than most practices for the same load reductions. The estimated costs for buffers are 10 times less than for the same nitrogen reductions for wet ponds, runoff reduction practices, and stream restoration. And again, the cost efficiency for impervious credit is much less for buffers and forest planting than a runoff reduction mix. Now we're going to take a quick look at case study number 3. Case study number 3 looks at if you're going to go for a Clean Water State Revolving Fund loan. And if you remember earlier in the talk, we learned that to get the max number of points for your load reduction score, you need to treat 2,000 pounds of nitrogen. So we're going to look at how much of these practices you need to do to get the 2,000 pounds of nitrogen reduction and how much those will cost. Again, I'm using the exact same MD FFIT and TIP tool assumptions. The only change in the assumption is that I changed the miscellaneous costs in the FFIT tool to make sure that I still get the $12,027 per acre that's in the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science document for tree planting. And basically, these are the results of trying to get to 2,000 pounds of nitrogen reduced. You can see for riparian forest buffers, we need 139.5 acres of that, and we need 180 acres of forest planting to get to that 2,000 pounds of reduction. You can see here the nitrogen reduction and the associated phosphorus and sediment reductions for each of those practices, and the equivalent impervious acre from those practices for meeting that nitrogen reduction goal. Then looking at what you would need to do for wet ponds, you would need to treat 550 acres via wet ponds with at least 374 being impervious acres, or treat 184 acres through runoff reduction practices with 125 being impervious acres to meet that 2,000-pound reduction. I do not have stream restoration on the slide, but I did run it, and you would need approximately 5 miles of stream restoration to get 2,000 pounds of nitrogen reduced. Just looking at more results for costing for case study number 3. To meet those 2,000 pounds of nitrogen reductions, the costs range from 1.6 million for buffers to 2 million for forest planting, and then 17 million for wet ponds and runoff reduction practices. Again, stream restoration is not on the slide, but it would be 16 million for stream restoration. And then the estimated annual cost efficiencies are the same that you saw in case study number 3. So the takeaway from this scenario is wet ponds and the runoff reduction practices cost 10 times higher than the buffers to meet that 2,000 pounds of nitrogen, and those practices cost about 8 times higher than forest planting to receive the same nitrogen reductions. And just a summary of case study number 3 is you need significant runoff reduction practices to meet that 2,000 pounds of nitrogen reduction. And again, you get more impervious credit from buffers and tree planting than runoff reduction. Estimated costs for buffers are 10 times less than other practices for the same nitrogen load reduction, and the cost efficiency for impervious credits is less for buffers and forest planting than runoff reduction practices. And with that, I am sure there are going to be a couple questions on the case studies.
Yeah, so we have one question right now, Mark,
Okay.
From Ed Morgareth. Asking, are the project type costs that you used just the initial implementation cost, or do they include, is it long-term cost, basically including O&M?
I go back to a slide. Where's my slide? So basically, these costs here are for the total installation cost plus 1 year, only 1 year of operation and maintenance. That was because, talking with Paul, FFIT calculates the total cost of the tree planting as the cost of implementation and 1 year of maintenance. So I wanted to try to make sure that we're comparing like and like. So I didn't want to use 20 years of maintenance on the traditional BMPs if that's not what's being done for the forest planting costs. So those total costs are for just 1 year of maintenance and the initial installation costs.
And this is Paul. If I could just add one thing, if the question by Ed, last term management is referring to personnel costs, then no, personnel is not included.
And then that was the only question thus far, Mark. Nope, literally one just came in. So new question from Elliot Campbell. Does your carbon sequestration calculation account for survival rate of seedlings?
And that would be a question for Paul.
I do not know the answer to that one, Elliot. I'll have to look that up. We do have a link within the tool the MD-FIT tool, which leads to where this calculation came from, but I do not know the answer to that question. So we will follow up with you.
We also have a hand raised from cleanstreams.com. So I'm hoping that you can put your question into the chat or through email so that we can have a written copy of it. It looks like her hand is not raised anymore, so we're good.
Okay. If there's any additional questions on this, we can come back to the case studies at the end of the presentation. But now I want to move on to talking about some GIS examples and how to look for these opportunities in GIS. GIS can be a very helpful tool in discovering areas of potential area for tree planting. MDE and DNR Forest Service can provide some technical assistance. DNR has a state forester and about a dozen county foresters throughout the state that can help advise on planting plans, species selection, and planting techniques. They can also connect interested government planters with NGOs and provide some general advice. DNR did do a potential tree planting opportunity analysis where they looked at various GIS land use layers to identify potential sources and did some data processing. They excluded areas such as airports and power lines where you cannot plant trees, and their methodology is available on request. At the bottom of the slide is a graph from one of their documents. On the left y-axis, this shows the amount of potential tree planting opportunities in acres. On the bottom, obviously, the counties, and the colors are basically the size of the parcels that have the trees in. So the darker the green, the larger the parcel sizes that are available for tree planting. And just looking at one example for Baltimore County, it looks like it had the most available area in DNR's analysis with about 20,000 acres of opportunity in parcels that are over 10 acres in size. The GIS you would need for this, you would obviously need land use or land cover. There are multiple sources of this. There is, land cover from MDE and use from MDP. There's information from the Chesapeake Bay program, the Chesapeake Bay Conservancy, which will be putting out new data shortly. There's multiple different types of data. There is in land cover data, you'll get things like tree canopy and impervious. In land use data, you'll get urban areas broken down into things like residential and commercial areas. And then you can use, those types of information to help identify landowners and where to plant. A note on mixed open. I know there was a question earlier on mixed open. We do encourage you to keep mixed open in your initial analyses. And then based on field verification, you can determine if it's actually mixed open or turf. As I was doing these GIS examples, there was a lot of mixed open area that I looked at in detail in the aerial view or Google Street View. And it's just managed turf that was miscategorized as mixed open. So I encourage you to keep the mixed open areas in your initial cut of areas to look for tree planting on turf to forest. You will also need some kind of boundaries, either property parcels, municipal boundaries, and political boundaries. You also need streams to look for areas that need riparian forest buffers, and you should really use aerial photos either in GIS or you can use Google Earth and Google Earth Street View to look at that. You can also look at other things such as man-made structures, and there's just a list of some other things that Maryland DNR used in their analyses. The generalized methodology is to just overlay the land cover or land use data with property owners. You can look for large areas of turf, especially those owned by, municipalities or government and institutional, but you need to verify that they're not parks or athletic fields is You really can't do tree planting on those. You can also look for industrial or commercial areas to do some planting on, or non-private residential or agriculture areas. You also need to look for exclusions, such as airpoint and power line corridors. And all this can be verified through aerial photos. Next, we're just going to look at a few examples. So this is the first example where I have, you can see I have the land cover. The greens are already forested areas. The yellow is mixed open and agricultural areas. The red, orange, and purple tints are turf, impervious, and the tree canopy. And I'm going to really zoom in on the top box, and then I'll do some zooming in on the second bottom box to show you potential opportunities and ways you can identify areas. So this is the first box without the land cover on it. You can see right away along the western side there's actual power line that you can see through in the aerial photo. So obviously we will not be able to plant into trees in that. But there are other opportunities in here. And, again, you can see how you can bundle properties and parcels to meet your tree planting acre goal. And initially, I found 0.75 acres on a residential property in their backyard. So you might be able to work with that property owner to plant trees there and then just, have his backyard merge into the surrounding area of trees. There's also a large church with 2.8 acres of that triangle area that is just grass that can be converted to a forested condition, along with additional acres around a wet pond in this area. There's also
cleaning
additional
out that outfall.
And yeah, there's additional 0.75 acres on a commercial property down here. Again, this can show you how you can bundle different properties together to get you to your goals. There's 2.3 acres on a residential area down here. When I initially looked at this, there's a grassy area here and a grassy area here. But this grass area has some tennis courts and some ball fields, so we don't want to plow over the kids' playgrounds. But we might be able to work with the community association or homeowners association to plant trees in this 2.3 area to get some credits and provide them incentives. There's also this large amount of agricultural land in the west. It all appears to be active, and I did check, and it does have the proper riparian buffer along a stream border in this area. But you might be able to work with the property owner to see if he's thinking about retiring some of these areas that he might be willing to plant trees on, or he might be retiring soon or something. You might be able to work with him to get some acreage from him, again through some incentives. And finally, on this example, there is 2.5 and 0.9 acres on agricultural land that is labeled as mixed open, but when I did street view, it's just turf. It's managed turf, so you might be able to work with a property owner to plant trees on that 3 acres of land to just merge it in with the forested area behind it to get a larger area, forested area. So that is the first example. Then we're going to look at the next example. For here, I'm showing you the closer view of the land cover information along with the parcel property boundaries. So you can see up in this area, there is like a large parcel property owner up here. And there's a bunch of mixed open here that are in large parcels that we might be able to look at. So we're going to look at this area in more detail. First, we'll look at it without the land cover on top of it. And first, we're going to look at that institutional area in the northwest. The first thing I noticed was the 3.45 acres on their property in this area. There's just sitting there waiting for trees, but on closer inspection, it does look like it might be a cemetery. So that just shows the importance of field verification. And then on this larger area is a church, an affiliated high school or school. Well, there's areas that are obviously ball fields, athletic fields, and other recreational fields. There are areas here, such as this 2.9 area in the other entrance, a 1.5 acre area in the middle by their parking lot, and a 2.3 along the existing tree line that you might be able to talk to them and provide incentives for them to plant. So all in all, that would be 7 acres of land on just on this one property parcel that could be planted on. Again, you know, a good opportunity to provide incentives and work with them to help reduce their maintenance cost on this land, help reduce the amount of gas they need to use on the land, and thus preventing greenhouse emissions. Looking at the residential areas, there are a bunch of areas that are available throughout the area. I did look at this area here, and this is an active farm. So I did not include that, but again, you can work with the farmer to see if he's ready to retire some of these areas for be planted with trees. And then all these yellow areas belong to homeowner associations or community associations. So again, you can work with them, show them the benefit of trees in their community, provide incentive. You have this strange shaped parcel that you can plant trees on that will just merge with the existing tree canopy back there. You have some areas which they could put trees in between different community lots, or a long, narrow patch of trees in this area to separate the houses from the farmers' fields. So again, all of these are different opportunities you can look for tree planting, and it shows you how you can look on private land and then work with landowners. Next, we're going to look at stream buffers. Methodology is a little bit different. You just need to create a buffer around the stream. For my example, I did use the 35-foot buffer, which is the minimum allowable. I just overlaid it with use and property owners and clipped it out. And then you can identify non-forested areas in the buffer. And I'll just give you a closer look at this one. Basically, for this one, all I did was zoom out, and then I looked for areas of yellow, which identified areas of mixed open or agricultural land that need buffers on them. And you can see here, there is one area that has a long stretch of stream that does not have any buffers on it. And then there's another area down here, again, that has a long area of stream that does not have tree canopy over it. So these are all opportunities to do riparian forest buffer on mixed open or agricultural land. With that, I will take any questions on the GIS analysis.
All right, so we had a question. I'm going to go back just slightly, Mark. There's a question that came in at the end of the last section, which I think Paul has now addressed, but it was regarding in the case studies that you had done and some of the analysis work, whether or not the costs for private easements were included in those total project costs. And I think Paul has answered that, but Mark, just to let you know, and maybe you can clarify, Paul had said that the FFIT scenario used a one-time cost of $6,000 per acre
Right.
as an incentive payment to landowners. So
right, and that was in the MDE fit for forest planting, but then I did not use the land costs in the traditional BMPs.
Gotcha. Okay. So I think that takes that addresses that question, and then we have a few others as well that have come in. One being from Linda Williamson, asking if current easements on properties that would not allow for plantings considered.
So, but Kurt, can you repeat the question?
Were current easements on properties that would not allow for plantings considered? So I think, if I understand correctly, basically, was maybe homeowner or private landowner, reluctance to plant on their property? Was that considered in any of the analytical work? I guess specifically referring to the GIS analysis, and I'm thinking
no, yeah, I didn't have access to any of that information, so that was not included. I don't know if she was referring to the DNR analysis that was done that I talked about, and I don't know about that either. But my guess would be that was not included in any of the analyses.
Yeah, and I think maybe, I don't know, Paul, if you can speak to the DNR work and whether or not there was an assumption before the assumption taken into consideration there.
That I do not know.
Okay.
I can try to follow up with DNR, with Iris Allen, and try to get back to Linda.
Okay, gotcha. And then there was also a question mark about MD Fit and it being customizable to other states. I don't know if Mark or Paul, if you want to take this. I guess I can. I feel like MD Fit is very customizable, and because it allows for various or variable inputs. So input, you can change cost, you can change crediting, etc. I feel like it would be, the framework itself is very customizable to other scenarios. But I don't know, Mark or Paul, if you have any other ideas or thoughts.
This is Paul. I would agree that it's highly customizable. However, because we're talking about the intersection of sort of forestry and MS4 permit compliance, it would be important to know in any other state or Commonwealth or district, what is their stormwater manual in terms of the compliance credit, which they would give for 1 acre of forestry. And then once that was adjusted, it could be implemented.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, any other questions?
There's been some back and forth in the chat. I think some of that kind of going back to it looks like Paul had provided some further information on the carbon crediting question. And then I think Iris chimed in regarding the DNR analysis and that it did not consider land ownership. So that goes back to Linda's question. It looks like there might be one more question from Sally Claggett. Sorry, I'm just seeing this now, so bear with me. Is it clear in FIT that the 1-year maintenance is for comparison purposes only, and that we know all/most BMPs, including tree planting, will require multiple years? And
I think I can answer a part of that. The reason why 1-year maintenance is given in FIT is what Mark explained, that he is trying to compare the FIT costs with the UMC's report costs. So he did add some quantity to the miscellaneous line item in order to balance them, to normalize it so that they could be compared fairly. But in MD Fit, there is this line item called miscellaneous. And in the tool, you can add you can quantify a cost. Let's say, for instance, if you want to have 3 years of maintenance, you can put it in that line item number 12, whatever you think the out year maintenance will be. So you can build it in, if that answers the question.
And then just one last item. So Linda Williamson did provide some clarification that I missed before to her original question. And she had said when you performed analysis of the properties to consider, were existing easements considered? So I guess meaning that, did the analysis take into consider current CREP easements or MET easements where maybe planting wouldn't be, you wouldn't be able to do any plantings? So I think
Now,
that's
on
just,
on these properties, when I identified these properties, I didn't look at the existing easements and stuff. I just looked at, property owners on this one to identify, these areas are all homeowners associations, and that was as far as I went to see if there was any easements on any of them. Something that you could add in your own analysis if you know those areas. I just didn't want to get too complicated in the GIS and case studies.
right.
And with that, we have about 15 minutes left, so I just want to get through the final few slides, and then we'll take additional questions at the end. So we're just going to move on to some final thoughts. First, final thoughts, some caveats to the presentation. You as implementers can select and use any BMP you prefer. Forest planning is not the sole solution or appropriate anywhere. To make forestry work, you would need to reach out to landowners, bundle projects together, and implement in various areas throughout your jurisdiction or county, and which could mean increased costs, administrative costs from the planning, communication, and such. And just a reminder that MDE does have the 2 guidance documents out there for waste load allocations. Phase 2 MS4 permittees are still under the 2014 guidance, where they can take advantage of the crediting in the 2021 guidance at the discretion of MDE, Stormwater Dam Safety, and Flood Management Program. Just some final thoughts on incentives. The incentives for county and municipalities are the increased ratio for impervious area acre credit, such as the 1.5 credit you would get from riparian forest buffers. As we saw in the case studies, the cost efficiencies are better for forest planning and buffers than traditional BMPs, and there's no permitting required, which can be a cost and time savings. Incentives to the landowner would be, per acre payment incentives and potential state income tax subtractions. Incentives to the overall public are public health metrics, such as reduced flooding, improved air quality, reduced heat island effects, and then also habitat creation and recreation. Incentives to the business community would be tree stock, labor, and materials could all be obtained locally, and it's a good opportunity for small minority business and youth workforce development. Now again, just summation of the presentation, why trees? There's multiple funding out there between, grants, the Tree Solution Now Act, and SRF funds. This is a good opportunity to actually implement on private land by reaching out to a larger audience of landowners, and then the county and municipality can get the credit if there's an agreement in place with the private landowners. And then of course, the cost savings relative to other practices. And finally, this is a remarkable opportunity for forestry. It does have legislative support through a funded initiative. They created the Maryland Commission for the Innovative and Advancement of Carbon Markets and Sustainable Tree Plantings through the Tree Solution Now Act of 2021. State agencies can also provide support through loans, grants, and other opportunities. They can also help municipalities obtain technical and other types of assistance. And the state grants are provided through Chesapeake Bay Trust, which again has a link in the bottom right. And I encourage you to check out the different grants that are available through them. Finally, if you have financial questions on the SRF, you can Jeffrey Fretwell, and there's his contact information. Watershed restoration credits, watershed restoration questions through Paul Emmer, and there is his contact information, and then there's my contact information along with Adriana's if you have questions on the PowerPoint presentation or such. And with that, Adriana has a few exit polls, and we will take any final questions at this time. And Adriana, I'll let you take over for the polls.
Yes, thank you. And thanks everybody for your attention, and hopefully this has been helpful. Before we get to the last couple of questions, we just want to get your feedback on the presentation, and are you more likely to recommend trees as part of restoration after this talk? So please give us a yes, no, maybe you're not sure, or not yet, but I'd like to. Okay. All right, so it looks like we have some coming in. We're not sharing these results, but I can tell you so far we've had about a little over 20 responses, so we'll give this a little bit more. It looks like for what we're seeing that close to 80% are now more likely to recommend trees as restoration after this talk. So that is great, and that was our goal with this webinar. Okay, I'm going to launch the next one. And this is also for just to get some feedback to MDE. Do you need some technical assistance? If you do, please enter your email address so they can follow up with you directly. We realize this webinar was very technical and there were lots of components. Give us your email address, and then MDE can follow up and provide some assistance. Okay. Okay, and then our last poll, we would just like to know, was this webinar helpful to you? If you can just give us a couple notes, some feedback, and let us know how we can improve webinars like these in the future. Okay. All right, I'm going to leave this poll open while we switch back to questions. So, Jeff, do we have some other questions?
Yeah, there were two. I have two down during that came in while Mark was kind of finishing up those last slides. The first of which was the question whether or not you could plant trees on one side of a stream and still receive RFB credit. And again, Mark, I think this is probably one for us. I don't know if you have anything to chime in on here before we take it, but if so, just let me know.
I will let you take this one.
Okay. I'm gonna have to. I believe the answer to that is yes, but I'm actually gonna have to go back to some of our accrediting experts here and follow up on that. I don't know that with 100% certainty, but we will circle back. And then the second question was about credit for, and I think if I have this right, I can go back. Let me go back to the exact question. Can you credit previous reforestation areas that are in existing forest conservation easements? I think that depends on the timing. Again, this is, are we talking about previous reforestation that is forest cons? Well, sorry. I guess it depends on, are we talking? Yeah, I guess it would be depend. We'll probably have to follow back on this one again. But I think it depends on, the timing of when those prior reforestation efforts took place.
Right.
Are we?
And Jeff,
oh, sorry, Mark,
it depends on like the land use also. If you're looking at the land
Right.
use, and when you're develop your baselines, if it was considered forest, then you're already getting credit for the forested condition. Is how I would look at it.
No, that I think that's a great point, Mark. Right.
And I haven't been looking at the chat, so is there anything else?
I'm not seeing anything else coming in. I don't know if you guys want to give it another minute or so, or what you're thinking, but I'm not seeing anything else coming in.
All right. We'll just give it a few more minutes. And if there's anyone else, has any questions or want more detail on anything, I guess just put it into the comments. And with that, I want to thank everyone for taking time to join us today, and also MDE for giving us this opportunity to present to you today.
Yes, thanks everybody for attending. And as a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and in about 2 weeks, we're going to send you a link to the recording in addition to a copy of the presentation, which you already received in the reminder emails. And any other updates or information will be sent to you via email. So we appreciate your time in registering and attending the webinar, and we hope it was helpful and that you learned a lot or are going to start planting more trees. Paul, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I second the thanks to everybody for participating, and I really think this is a fabulous time for forestry, and I think if we all work together on this and get the municipalities and the counties credit, I think it'll be a great benefit to the state. So thank you all.
All right. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you guys, much appreciated.